Okay, welcome, guys. No music this time, just jumping right into the lecture. So we're going to be talking about expected inflation. We're going to be doing it on NyQuil, and well, we're going to have to do it at a pace that's quick enough such that well, the pink elephants don't show up in the middle of this lecture. That'd be weird. So last time we talked about the quantity theory of money, and we talked about the role that changes in monetary aggregates have on changes in inflation and all that good stuff. We talked a little bit about expected inflation, namely like with price level determinacy, where if the price level and the inflation rate are both determined, well then we have price level determinacy, and that's good stuff that makes us happy. So now we're going to talk about a little bit more about expected inflation. It's going to be more of an applied type of lecture instead of a like theoretical sort of thing. Namely, what we're going to be talking about will be deviations in expected inflation from actual inflation and what that means for the aggregate economy. Now, I originally made a lecture that, it was ended up coming out to about an hour and a half or so because I go off on a little bit of a tangent with different interest rate rules, how that can affect inflation, therefore how that can affect expected inflation. And it just happened to be a little long, and I didn't want to put you guys through all that stuff. So I decided to re-record the video, and I'm splitting it up into two parts. So this is part one of two that's covering this particular topic. So inflation expectations are guided by monetary policy. Whenever the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, from now on I'm just going to say FOMC if you wonder what that means, well, Federal Open Market Committee. So whenever the FOMC chair makes an announcement about their plans for monetary policy, they typically discuss their decision for the target federal funds rate. They'll usually give like a range of the federal funds rate. They'll give like an upper bound and a lower bound. Last week when Fed Chair Jerome Powell came out, he gave a range of 0 to 25 basis points, or 0% to about 0.25%. A basis point is a 0.01% when we're talking about interest rates here. So they come out, they discuss their plans for where the interest rate is going to go via their open market operations over the next whatever time horizon they're suggesting. Jerome Powell basically said that, consistent with their dual mandate to achieve stable prices and maximize employment, they wanted to maintain the federal funds rate at that range of 0 to 25 basis points, really until the economy shows significant evidence of recovery. So that's really guiding the expected future path of interest rates. And since the interest rate is related to inflation, the expected future path of interest rate can be related to expected inflation. And this is just done via the Fisher equation. So if the Fed wants to use monetary policy by setting the nominal interest rate to hopefully affect the real economy through the real interest rate, the Fisher equation, if we were to solve this out for the real interest rate, would be given by this right here. Right? All I did was just subtract inflation from the left-hand side of that equation, and that just leaves the real interest rate being the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. And, well, hey, what do you know? This next bullet point says exactly what I just said. So real interest rate is equal to the nominal rate minus the rate of inflation, or expected inflation. So if interest rates are cut, right, what happens is the Fed increases the money base. They increase the money base by buying certain treasury securities from financial institutions, and they ultimately convert those treasury securities, which are relatively illiquid assets, into more liquid assets, hence cash. So that cash goes into the money base. Now, we know the money base is not the same as the money supply. So if we increase some monetary aggregate, it's usually going to lead to some kind of an increase in prices. But it depends on what monetary aggregate is being changed that will determine what the change in price is going to be. Either way, even if we increase the monetary base, there's still likely to be an increase in the price level, hence an increase in inflation to some extent. Right? So if the price level goes up, if you just remember the formula for inflation, new price minus old price over old price, Well, new price goes up, old price stays the same because you can't go back in time and change things unless you have a DeLorean with plutonium and you can go 88 miles an hour. Great Scott! If you can't do that, well, the only thing that can change is the new price. So the new price goes up. It only shows up in the numerator. The denominator stays the same. So because fractions, if the price level goes up, the inflation rate will go up. So if the Fed announced their policy, then the public is going to expect inflation to be something along the lines of what the Fed said that they were aiming for, right? They wanted a 2% target, and they have a 2% target for inflation, and they were going to use their monetary policy to try to achieve that. Hence, their decision, their announcements on what they're going to be doing via these interest rates will be determining what happens with inflation. So they say they want an inflation rate at or around 2%, and they want to keep this inflation rate so that banks can set their interest rates for loans conditional on where they expect inflation to go during the length of that loan. If inflation increases before that loan matures, then the bank can lose money. What do I mean by this? Well, okay, we have an inflation rate of 2%. Let's say that the inflation rate is 2% and expected inflation is also 2%. Well, if that's the case, then they will make a loan. Let's say they make a loan with a 5% nominal interest rate with the expectation that inflation is 2%. Well, that tells us the real interest rate is going to be 3%. So they're doing pretty good. But what happens if there's a deviation between inflation and expected inflation? And there's an inflationary spike that brings the rate of inflation up to, say, 6%. Well, now the real interest rate is negative 1%, and the bank lost money on that. That's not good. And that's going to lead to higher interest rates because banks are going to go, well, basically there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of volatility in the expected inflation rate. Because, well, you'll update your expectations based on what happened with where inflation has gone in the past. If we're, making an adaptive expectations assumption here, then that can raise interest rates, or it'll introduce volatility into the markets. It's not really very good. It's not what we want to have happen. So the Fed wants to guide the public's expectations about inflation for the future, because if the public can expect more stable policy, that can lead to more stability in their economic behavior. Namely, like interest rates will be relatively stable. Too much volatility in expectations for inflation is a very bad thing. Because, like I said, if you expect inflation to go from 2% this year to 6% next year and then back down to 2% the following year, right, what do you think would happen? How would your saving consumption behavior change? Right, because remember, if the interest rate goes up, you're going to want to save more and consume less. If the interest rate goes down, you're going to want to consume more and save less, right? Well, think about the inflation rate here. Think about how that ties to interest rates, and think about what that's going to do in terms of your consumption saving behavior, right? And think about it on your own. You're going to think about the Fisher equation. You're also going to want to think about money demand, money supply, really the intersection between money demand and money supply, so equilibrium in the money markets. Think about what's going to happen to the demand for money, and that will kind of help guide your thought process on how the savings and consumption behavior will be changing in response to this major variability in expected inflation. And it's just a nice little, thought experiment for you. You can talk about it. Talk about it with your friends. If you're at a party, you can talk, with people at a party about it, especially if you don't want to, have any friends at the party. So, yeah, just think about this on your own and, just try to think about what would happen. Now, the Fed can consistently communicate their plans for inflation, namely through FOMC announcements. The chair comes out, makes an announcement about what they're trying to do, and what they say will, in part, update expectations for inflation. If the Fed can do this, the public will be less likely to react to a short-run spike in prices due to like a non-monetary shock, like a hike in oil prices or an increase in food prices. Now, we can say that what the Fed's trying to do is they're trying to anchor inflationary expectations. If inflation expectations are anchored down, then the economy is likely to be more stable. So what we're going to do is we're going to quote Fed Chairman, or former Fed Chairman, Ben Bernanke. Probably the best Fed Chairman in my lifetime, because really all I had was Greenspan, Bernanke, Yellen, and then Powell. Yellen was pretty good. Greenspan was awesome. I mean, there's nothing really bad you can say about Greenspan. Bernanke was great because, well, Bernanke was an academic, and he kind of brought his academic mindset into monetary policy, which was really awesome, given that he was an already very, very, very well-established and highly regarded monetary economist. So in that case, I think he was a little bit better. Yellen was all right. She kind of just carried on what Ben Bernanke did. Nothing particularly controversial about her, at least within the monetary community. Most monetary economists think she actually did fairly well. Jerome Powell, I'm slightly less impressed with, but I'm going off on a tangent. We can talk about that some other time. Anyways, to quote him, the extent to which inflation expectations are anchored can change depending on economic developments and, most important, the current and past conduct of monetary policy. Right? So remember when I was talking about the changes in monetary policy will be affecting what happens to inflation expectations. Right? It's what Bernanke is saying here. In this context, I use the term anchored to mean relatively insensitive to incoming data. So, for example, if the public experiences a spell of inflation higher than their long-run expectation, but their long-run expectation changes little as a result, then inflation expectations are well anchored. If, on the other hand, the public reacts to a short period of higher than expected inflation by marking up their long-run expectations considerably, then expectations are poorly anchored. Basically, if inflation expectations are relatively insensitive to short-run deviations in inflation from expected inflation, then we have well-anchored expectations of inflation. On the other hand, if the expectations of inflation vary widely with, again, a short period or a short-run deviation of actual inflation from expected inflation, then they're not that well anchored. Now, the Fed can only anchor these expectations so much. A lot of it also has to do with variations within the market itself. So the Fed is doing the best they can with what they have, but they don't have like full control over anchoring these expectations. If they did, I would imagine inflation expectations would be a lot closer to what actual inflation is. So what happens if the expected inflation rate increases? Well, we first get an increase in the nominal interest rate, and thus the opportunity cost of holding money, along with a decrease in the demand for money. We have the same nominal quantity of money as before, right? So if we look at this, we got the money demand equals money supply. That M naught over PT is money supply, and that F of YT with that little pink RT is the function for money demand, right? So we've got the same nominal quantity of money with an equilibrium in money markets. Now, let's just go ahead and, because that nominal interest rate is equal to the real interest rate plus the expected inflation rate, right? If we got the left-hand side equals the right-hand side of that equation in pink, then, well, if we have the left-hand side in equation 2, we can also just plug the right-hand side of that into equation 2 instead. So that's what we do. So I plug the real rate plus the expected inflation rate in for the nominal rate in equation 2, and this gives me equation 3. So now what this says is that money demand is a function of real income, YT, the real interest rate plus the expected inflation rate. So now we've got money demand expressed as a function of the expected inflation rate, where they expect inflation to go. So from that, if expected inflation increases and there's no change in the real interest rate, right, then the nominal interest rate is going to have to go up because, it's going to have to maintain equality with this RT equals lowercase rt plus expected inflation, right? It's going to have to maintain equality. If the right-hand side of that goes up, the left-hand side also has to go up. So from this, expected inflation goes up, then the nominal interest rate has to go up. And since money demand is decreasing in the interest rate, right? Remember, we had that downward sloping money demand where the price of the money was the interest rate. A higher interest rate means a lower quantity of money demanded. The increase in expected inflation will increase the price level, which reduces the real quantity of money. So the nominal quantity of money is the same. However, because there is now a change in the price level, the real quantity of money falls. Neither inflation nor expected inflation are particularly good things, but what's especially bad is if there's a deviation between inflation and expected inflation. And I should have said a persistent deviation between inflation and expected inflation. So suppose inflation expectations are at 2% per year. There's an increase in expected inflation. Well, what's going to happen? Well, it drives up expected inflation. And as a result, these expectations are no longer properly anchored. Workers will want higher wages to be able to cover the expected rise in their prices. Now, of course, we're making the assumption here that workers actually have this kind of bargaining and negotiating power to be able to negotiate higher wages. Assuming they can, they negotiate that, they get more pay, and as a result of the increase in costs that these firms now have to face, because no matter what anybody likes to say, labor is a cost to the firm. If you pay more for labor, your costs of production will increase. And because the production costs go up, right, there's a number of things that could happen. They could keep the same number of people, but they would have to raise prices. They could kind of cut the number of people they're hired or that are working for them and sort of scale back production. They could also cut the number of workers and employ more capital, right? But that would be dependent on the elasticity of substitution between labor and capital. Some companies, that's a thing, like, McDonald's. I'm sure you've heard that, well, if we go to $15 an hour minimum wage, then we're going to have kiosks everywhere. Well, yeah, it's because for that particular type of worker, there's a fairly favorable elasticity of substitution between labor and capital. If the cost of labor goes up, you can switch to capital relatively easily and install kiosks instead. But let's just assume for a moment that that can't happen. So the cost of production goes up. They have to hire these workers, but now at a higher wage. That's going to have to raise their output price, right? If the costs of production go up, then you have to raise the price that you're going to charge on these goods that they're producing. And this causes what's known as cost push inflation. If the cost of production goes up, that's going to push the increase in their output prices, thus increasing inflation, hence cost push inflation. Thus, the increase in expected inflation can actually become kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If inflation expectations go up, it can be difficult to bring down inflation. This is what the U.S. saw in the late 1970s. We had high unemployment and high inflation, and it was the result of some of it were supply shocks, which the Federal Reserve isn't particularly tailored to be good at. But there were also other issues such as relatively loose monetary policy because of, we could say, a misunderstanding of the relationship between inflation and unemployment. So we ended up with high unemployment and high inflation, which was known as stagflation. And we can talk about that a little bit later as well. Now, there are also problems with, because in the last situation that I showed you guys, we had expected inflation being higher than actual inflation. But there's problems when expected inflation is persistently lower than actual inflation. And that's because when banks make loans, the interest rates that they compute are based on the expected rate of inflation over the life of that loan. So when nominal interest rates are really, really low, as they currently are in the U.S., and we have a low rate of expected inflation, and sadly also a low rate of inflation, that's going to keep interest rates even lower. And that sounds nice, right? Like, who doesn't want lower interest rates? Everybody wants lower interest rates. But when the Fed operates monetary policy by trying to influence interest rates, namely reducing interest rates should we go into a recession, if interest rates are already low as a result of low expected inflation, then they have little ability to actually stimulate the economy in a recession because interest rates are low. It's not really very good. Why is that not good? Well, if interest rates are low and they want to cut interest rates, there's a zero lower bound in the United States. We do not go below zero for nominal interest rates. If interest rates are at 1%, but we would need to cut interest rates by, say, 5% to stimulate economic activity, well, we can only do 20% of that before, we're stuck. Sorry, guys. We've done all we can. So expected inflation below the actual rate of inflation can also be a bad thing. As the current Fed Chairman Jerome Powell said while announcing the change in their target inflation rate, basically going from we want 2% inflation per year to we want an average of 2% inflation per year. So if there's, say, a quarter where inflation is a little bit below 2%, they'll aim to have a quarter where inflation is a little bit above 2% so that it would sort of average out annually to 2% inflation per year. As he said, inflation that runs below its desired level can lead to an unwelcome fall in longer-term inflation expectations, which in turn can pull actual inflation even lower, resulting in an adverse cycle of even lower inflation and inflation expectation. This dynamic is a problem because expected inflation feeds directly into the general level of interest rates. Well-anchored inflation expectations are critical for giving the Fed the latitude to support employment when necessary without destabilizing inflation. But if inflation expectations fall below our 2% objective, interest rates would decline in tandem. In turn, we would have less scope to cut interest rates and boost employment during an economic downturn, further diminishing our capacity to stabilize the economy through cutting interest rates. We've seen this adverse dynamic play out in other major economies around the world and have learned that once it sets in, it can be very difficult to overcome. We want to do what we can to prevent such a dynamic from happening here. So now that we've kind of talked about that, let's look at actual versus expected inflation. For actual inflation, we use the core PCE inflation. This is the inflation rate used by the Federal Reserve to, monitor inflation. It's a chain-weighted price index, but it leaves out food and oil prices. They do this to reduce volatility in the inflation rate because the Fed's a little bit more concerned with long-run inflation rather than short-run stuff, right? So if there's a spike in oil prices one quarter, but it's only for one quarter, it's not a persistent one, then that'll introduce volatility if they were to keep that in there. But if they don't, they get kind of a nice smoother estimate of what's going on with the price level. So there are other consumer goods in there. It's just food and oil prices aren't in there. Because, like I said, food and gas prices can be pretty volatile in the short run. And they're also those are also driven a little bit more by supply shocks than other consumer goods that are on the market. And like I said, monetary policy isn't particularly good at dealing with supply shocks. They're better at dealing with demand shocks. So for expected inflation, what we do is we use the 10-year break-even inflation rate. This inflation rate represents a measure of expected inflation derived from 10-year Treasury constant maturity securities and 10-year Treasury inflation indexed constant maturity securities. So basically, these are measures of inflation based on the yields from 10-year Treasury bonds. And then there's also an inflation indexed 10-year Treasury bond. It basically, because of inflation, especially weird deviations in inflation over, the next 10 years, this particular security will actually pay based on changes in the inflation rate. So, it's a little bit safer right? Because it's indexed for inflation. The yield, the rate of return, is indexed for inflation. And these values, based on, how it's derived from these securities, implies what market participants expect inflation to be over the course of the next 10 years on average. So here I've plotted out core PCE inflation and the 10-year forward expected inflation rate. Now we can see something kind of interesting. One, at the beginning, we seem to have pretty wide divergences between the expected inflation rate and the actual inflation rate. However, around 2016 or so, we can see they actually get quite close to each other. But we can also see that for the most part, save a couple of episodes here and there, expected inflation is much lower than the actual inflation. And that can be for a number of reasons. One, actual inflation is unfortunately unable to unable to capture or control for a particular effect of a price change, right? Because there's an income effect and there's a substitution effect. The substitution effect, which is always going to be negative. If the price of something goes up, you demand less of it and more of something else instead. That effect can't be captured in these types of price indices. So if that effect is always negative and we can't capture it, then these measures of inflation are always overstating what actual inflation is. So there could be that, but chances are it's not all just that. There's probably other stuff going on as well. So we can see that the expected inflation rate's consistently below the actual PCE inflation rate. In math speak, it means expected inflation is less than actual inflation. According to Chair Powell, if this happens, if expected inflation is less than the actual inflation rate, then because expected inflation is so low, it can drag down actual inflation. And remember, expected inflation deviations from actual inflation can sort of become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Here, expected inflation is quite low, and because banks lend out based on where they expect inflation to be, their interest rates are low, and it can make it hard for the Fed to lower interest rates during a recession to try to mitigate the effects of a business cycle. We can also look at a graph of the difference between actual and expected inflation. So what I did here, if the expected inflation rate is less than the actual inflation rate, then the expected inflation rate minus the inflation rate should be negative. Therefore, at any point in time, if actual inflation is greater than expected inflation, then expected inflation minus actual inflation will yield a negative result. And boom, what do you know? Save a couple of periods here and there, right? This difference is negative. So anywhere that you see this blue line below zero, which is that solid horizontal black line, anywhere it's below that, right, we have actual inflation exceeding expected inflation. So inflation expectations are quite low. Now, we don't want this to be above zero either, because that can lead to some other problems as well. But what we would like to see is that it is within, some tiny neighborhood of zero, right? Because the closer it is to zero, then the more actual inflation equals expected inflation, and the more inflationary expectations are well anchored. So this is going to conclude this lecture at probably 31 minutes by the time I'm done bloviating about the stuff. We talked about expected inflation. We talked about why it was important. We talked about what the Fed can try to do to anchor expectations of inflation. We talked about what happens if it is not anchored and what implications that would have for monetary policy as well as the stability of the economy. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to cover some of the implications regarding interest rate rules and how expected inflation plays a role in that process. We're going to talk about, one rule in particular known as a Taylor rule, which is kind of like an interest rate setting rule, more like rule of thumb, for central banks to follow, where they will use deviations of inflation from their target, so actual inflation from the target rate of inflation, and then deviations in actual output from what potential output is. And they will factor that into how they want to set the nominal interest rate. It's kind of like an expansion of sorts on the Fisher equation. And if these deviations of actual inflation from target and real GDP from potential real GDP, if those deviations are zero, meaning that they're equal to each other, then the whole thing actually reduces down to the Fisher equation. So that's going to come up in the next video. This one will be posted probably an hour or two before the other is. It takes a little bit of time to render these videos after I'm done making the lecture, and then it also takes a little bit of time to upload them. So I will keep you posted. Be on the lookout for the other video, and then we will go from there. So until then, enjoy your day, and yeah,